Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/slash Tales from Tech Support. In today's episode, measure thrice, pull once. Search and destroy. Is your number lock on? Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Measure thrice, pull once. Long time lurker, I think fourth or fifth time poster. Lost count. Anywho, here's a quick tale that ended up longer than I thought it would, that I find myself recalling to colleagues too often and just realized I never shared it in here. I was the sole Tier 2 IT guy in the state for an international company that had headquarters at least a time zone away, but had network management outsourced half a day away. I covered 3 sites and served as the eyes, ears, and fingers of the various teams that oversaw the data centers and networks. During the early spring, I got an email from the data center team saying they have a fan error on one of their power supplies. I forgot what piece of equipment it was, but it was clearly being monitored from afar and worth my attention. One quick walk through a testing lab and 2 different levels of raised floor later, and I entered what I often referred to as my sanctuary. A well-cooled data center, filled with that white noise that I'm sure many of y'all have grown to enjoy. It even had empty spaces in the racks where one could lay a piece of plywood across 4 racks and fit an IT guy needing a nap. This was a fact I never got to fully utilize, but it was often a nice daydream. It didn't take long for me to find the fan. It's one of 2 larger power supplies in some rather large network appliance that, again, I've forgotten the exact function of as I type this. One of the fans was running, and the one next to it had stopped, and had some gray and brown debris next to it. Upon closer inspection, I recoiled, but then began laughing my *s off while rummaging for my phone to snap a picture. A Miller moth had somehow managed to get inside what is supposed to be a mostly sealed room with the exception of the door and air conditioning. As it flew around the room, no doubt trying to chase all the various blinking lights around the room, it had managed to fly into this power supply fan. Suffice to say, I was easily able to make a comparison to a bird hitting a jet engine, except the little bits of wings and a couple legs made the event seem more like a wood chipper accident. In any case, this moth was apparently big enough to actually cause a failure inside the power supply and kill the fan motor. With my findings, photo, and a slew of Monty Python jokes prepped for the email, it is an X-moth, it has ceased to be, it has shuffled off this mortal coil, and right into some coils inside the PSU etc., I headed back to my desk and replied to the data center team's email. Shortly after sending the reply, my link popped up with a LOL from the data center guy who had emailed me. He had appreciated my detailed description, complete with Monty Python reference. We then began discussing replacing this PSU, including a maintenance window. As most organizations go, the maintenance window had to be after hours. I CC'd my manager on the email so he could approve the overtime, and I spent the next week waiting for the part to come in. In a surprising twist, logistics managed to get the part to arrive half a week early. Despite this miracle, we still stuck with the planned window. The evening of the replacement, I took the time to walk around the office and just take in how eerie it was for no one to be there except for me. Various ideas in the big list of things to do in the office when no one else is around passed through my mind. Unfortunately, or fortunately, none of those ideas were capitalized on due to my being tired and just wanting to get started on my 45-minute commute home as soon as possible. I walked the part from my staging area, an empty spot on my desk, to the data center, and started making ready to swap out the PSU. It's so nice living in an age of standardized parts and hot swapping. The whole ordeal itself didn't even need any tools. Just unscrew the screws keeping the PSU in by hand, unplug it from the UPS connection beneath the floor, pull out the PSU, and reverse the process with the new one. Seems easy enough, right? No problem. First step was to get under the floor. It was a raised one, so I had to dig out and dust off the hook we left hanging on one of the racks. I pulled up the tiles and suddenly had to reassess my entire outlook on life at this organization. Beneath the pristine cable organization and crisp cleanliness of this data center was a veritable hellscape of wires and plugs. It was as if all the repressed frustration of the team that put this place together was quite literally buried under the finished and polished product. It was like some kind of cable management graveyard after what was clearly a sysadmin version of the purge. Yes, plugs were labeled, but half the labels were worn out from other wires sitting and rubbing on them. With hook and flashlight in hand, I started pulling up more tiles until I had pulled open a fissure from where the PSU cord went into the floor and where the UPS plugs were coming in. Seeing a larger portion of the place where cable management goes to die didn't make it much easier. Much like the present-day gawkers looking at the fissures in Hawaii spewing lava, all I could do was take photos with my work phone to send back to the data center team. I knew full well that my manager wasn't going to let them dump an entire cable reorganization project on me. Besides, I always wanted to meet some of these data center guys. They seemed nice, and it kinda sucks being the only IT guy in the state. After taking another look at the mess, I finally got down to business and started tracing the PSU cable. Mind you, this wasn't your typical power cord. This thing had some girth to it. Unfortunately, so did everything else under that floor, including the cables from the UPS to their respective plugs. Between the lack of light and the tangled mess, I was having moments of cable racism, because all these cables looked exactly the same. I traced the cord, tied a piece of painter's tape around it where it plugged into one of the UPS connections, and then went back to the PSU to trace it again. I'm a human being. I've made mistakes. Making flaming mistakes is a familial trait on my mom's side. She managed to kill an entire magazine distributor's print queue in the early 90s with one malformed print command, and I was no exception. I traced this cable again, pulling on it to see what moved beyond the knot it was passing through. Once again, I made my way to the painter's tape. I was victorious. I had managed to wander through this valley in the shadow of cable spaghetti, and get the same result. Now it was time to pull this cord from the stone, and be crowned king of the Britons. Anyone that's had to do anything in a data center related to power probably knows full well how tough this twist-lock plugs can be. Given how long these cables had been plugged in, and how much anger I could feel radiating from this pit of wires, extracting this plug was no small task. After twisting it for some time, I got it to turn to the pull-out position. With a solid guy using muscle for manly things grunt, I pulled the cord from the plug. And then there was silence. No. This wasn't just me taking a breather. This was silence. The typical hum of fans in the data center had ceased. I hadn't been in an area this quiet since wandering around the empty offices. It was unnerving, and I could only hear one thing. Put it back, put it back, put it back, put it back. To this day, I cannot recall if that voice was in my head, or coming out of my mouth. All I knew was panic followed by a multitude of attempts to cram that plug back into the receptacle from whence it came. Thankfully, having been extracted already, this plug was able to be plugged back in with minimal effort. I even did another grunt when I twisted it back to the locked position. A familiar hum started to return to the room. Lights began coming back on. What was dark turned red, then orange, and eventually green. Life returned to the Cisco IP phone on the desk. I sat there, wiping a bit of cold sweat from my brow, as I did a very casual inventory of all the systems from a distance, looking for any lights that hadn't come back on automatically. It took a couple of minutes for me to recollect myself, and then pick myself up to go manually power on a couple of the older servers. As I went over to them, I saw that the big smart PDU we had in the back of the rack was complaining about a recent power loss. I got the older servers started up, and went back to the PDU. I then checked the cord coming from it and running towards the floor, and had a head slap moment. The PDU cord crossed over with the PSU cord behind the rack in a way that I had missed. While I was successful in tracing the cord from the floor to the UPS plug in cable management hell, I had been tracing the wrong cord. Again, cord racism, they all looked exactly the same. I had unplugged the PDU that was powering most of the network core, and all of the servers that hadn't been retired and shut down. The accidental moment of silence resulted. A few minutes later, I was able to successfully trace the cord from the PSU all the way down the rack and to where it plugged into the UPS plug underneath. Another piece of masking tape with an actual label went onto the plug, and then I went to tracing again from the plug back up to the PSU. I traced it back up the rack, back to the dead PSU with moth pieces. Following that, I traced it back down the rack, into the floor, through the electrical spaghetti monster, and back to the labeled plug. A twist and a pull later, and nothing happened. This was a case of nothing happening being the best thing that could happen. I pulled the cord through the twists and turns, my mind treating it like a victory parade. Got it past the floor, and pulled the busted PSU out, cord and all. I put the new PSU in, ran the cord on top of the slithering snake pit, left a painter's tape label on the plug, and plugged it in. I wrote down the PDU label on the plug I had accidentally pulled so as to avoid that mistake in the future. With both power supplies running, I closed the fissure I'd pulled open into the floor, and then went over to the Cisco phone to call our after-hours network team on the other side of the world. So, you're probably wondering why Dollar Location fell off the face of the earth for about 10 minutes. Funny story. Search and destroy. I recently started a new office job. I was told certain documents I'd need were available on the company website. One document is a customer request form for files on a CD. We use that about 50 times a day, so I need to print them a lot. The document can be found from the company website's homepage by typing CD in the search bar. The whole thing is surprisingly well indexed. My boss has a 30-step process for finding that same document, that involves opening a Word document where a direct link is saved, and using that link as a template to follow. She does not click the link. She types the companywebdomain.com into her browser and clicks through /all/the/sub/links to open the right page by drilling down from the home page. Whereas I can print 50 pages before she can open the document. The other day she handed me a different document and asked me to photocopy it. I asked, "Is this also on the company website?" "Yes," she replied, "but it's too hard to find, so I just keep recopying this copy." There was a document number, 3817, on the bottom of the page. I told her to type 3817 in the search bar. It came right up. She was like, "How did you do that?" I worry that teaching her search skills will destroy my job by making her more competent. Well, I'm not that worried. Is your number lock on? Recently I was on a call with my program manager, PM, and her support person, SP. PM is nearing 70 and not technical at all. SP is a know-it-all. I'm a software engineer. Edit for clarity, SP does admin and whatever work PM give him, not actually tech support. When we get on the call, PM mentions she's having a lot of trouble with her laptop this morning and sounds close to tears. I ask a few basic questions like, "What's it doing?" She explains that when she types letters she gets numbers. Apparently SP told her to restart the machine multiple times, but it didn't help. He's been trying to help her for about 30 minutes now. He then says that she needs her keyboard replaced. This upsets her more because getting that replaced where we work could take weeks. Me, what happens when you typo? PM, I get a 6. Me, your number lock is on. I then explained how to shut off number lock. It takes all of 1 minute to diagnose the problem, explain how to fix it, and test it. PM is thrilled and SP shuts up for the first time in his life. It was a nice meeting.